Okay, welcome back. We are ready to begin again. Or, well, continue with where we left off anyway. When we got done, we had just taken a look at various viewport modes, including wireframe, shaded, textured, and lit, which are attached to 4. If I put focus back on Maya, 4 for wireframe, 5 for shaded, 6 for textured, and 7 for lit. Now, there are some other things about the viewport that you need to know about as well. For instance, the viewport has its own menu bar. Now, I'm not going to go over each and everything that you'll find within this, but it's a good idea to know generally what you'll find within it. The view menu is all about controlling what you actually are doing inside the viewport. So every single viewport has a camera associated with it. That's just one of Maya's little features. If you are coming to this from, say, Blender, this is not something that you'll be used to. Inside of Blender, you have a floating view, like a viewport, and then you have the camera. Inside of Maya, you're always looking through a camera, and you can look at the attributes for that camera by going into the View menu and choosing Select Camera, or you can go to the Camera Attribute Editor, which will take a look at its attributes. Now, a quick thing. You will notice on the right-hand side that you have some tabs that allow you to toggle between the Attribute Editor and the channel box. Here's the primary difference between the two. They both look very different. In essence, they do essentially the same job, but the big difference is that the channel box are all of the attributes that can be animated. The attribute editor shows all of the attributes, period. Each and every one of them. So for instance, here we have the focal length, which is 35 millimeter. And as I adjust that, that is actually like zooming a real camera in and out. Or if you want, you can change the angle of view and get the same result. It just depends on, are you used to thinking in terms of lens millimeter, or do you want to think of it in terms of your overall field of view? So I'm going to set that back to 35 millimeter. Okay, so there's the view menu. Again, it's just about kind of controlling what you see here. You have things like bookmarks if you want to save a particular view of the viewport. Not a bunch of stuff I really want to get into right now. The shading menu allows you to control what things look like in your viewport. So for instance, you can set things to wireframe, which you'll notice has a hotkey of the 4 key. You can smooth shade everything. You can flat shade things, but that's not really going to be visible to us. So what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to hold down the Shift key. And shift and right mouse, and let's create a polysphere, and I'll just make one over here. And you'll see that sphere looks pretty smooth, but that's because my shading is set to smooth shade all. If I set this to flat shade all, you can see each one of those facets. And you have some other things as well. You have, say, bounding boxes, which give you the overall sizes of objects. Or points, which just show you the location of vertices. Now, somebody just asked a question. Please try to keep official questions over in the questions section of the webinar, but I did just happen to know this, or to notice this. Is the output window important? It opens every time I open Maya, and it will. It always will. Really, for the most part, and for our purposes, you'll probably never really need the output window. The output window is really nice, though, if you're trying to monitor a render and see at what point Maya is crashing, or look for feedback from a script or things like that. But for our purposes, we won't really need it. Next, we have the lighting menu. This allows you to control the types of lights that are displaying in your view. So do you want to see the result of all of your lighting, or no lights? Or do you want to just use selected lights? I'm keeping this very simple, though. Next, the show menu allows you to control what you can and can't see. For instance, if I turn off polygons, everything seems to disappear because all of these objects were polygon models. So just a quick idea. These are just flags to let it control what you can and can't see. And we can turn off the grid if we want to, or the HUD, like so. Next, we have the renderer. We have default quality rendering, we have high quality rendering, and then as of Maya 2012 and later, we have Viewport 2.0, which has seen a lot of additional features and functionality added to it as of Maya 2013. Not every video card out there supports it, so I'm certainly not telling you to turn it on. But if you do, and if your video card supports it, you'll get a clearer, stronger, better, more fun to play with algorithm for calculating your view, which looks really nice in a fully rendered scene. But we're going to go ahead and leave it off for now. Next, you have the panels menu, and this actually is a really important menu that you should play with at some point. This allows you to switch through the various types of things that can be put inside of this viewport area, because really, what you're looking at here for this viewport is just a panel, and this panel can be used to show various types of windows. Right now, a perspective view just happens to be one of those windows. Now, there are two types of view available to us. We have perspective and we have orthographic. Now, I realize some of you are new to 3D and some of you aren't, but is there anybody out there who'd care to tell me what the difference is between perspective and orthographic? Depth. Flash is already all over it. A perspective view gives you a sense of depth. Now, what do I mean when I say that? Well, we know that all of these blocks are just duplicates of one another. And that would mean that they're all the same size. However, from this view, it looks like the top of this one is a whole lot wider than the view of this one, just like the real world. Things get smaller as they recede into the distance. In an orthographic view, however, things stay the same. That sense of depth doesn't actually affect anything. So for instance, if I was to look at this from a side view, and then I'll just move this guy out of the way, and we'll move this one down, and move this one, and let me go ahead and hide the grid too, just so that there's no confusion there. All these blocks are still receding into the distance, but you'll notice they don't get any smaller. It's because we don't have any depth that we are calculating. Everything remains the same size. So there's your primary difference. Now, inside of Maya, by default, you have a 4 view that is active. So you can tap the spacebar, and you have access to a top view, a front view, and a side view that you can navigate independently of one another. Now let's take just a second and talk about these orthographic views. If you're brand new to 3D, you may find yourself wondering why you would ever need these. But if you're ever building things with a high level of precision, especially things based off of schematics, then an orthographic view can really be the difference between whether or not your shape is working and whether it's not. So definitely don't write off your orthographic views. Navigating them is its own thing. It's very easy. It's very similar to navigating a perspective view, but there are a few primary differences. You're still going to hold down the Alt key. Because it's an orthographic view, you cannot tumble it. If you are coming to this from 3ds Max, no, there are no user views, or such as Blender, where you can just rotate any old view and make it orthographic. You can't do that here. Orthographic views are always looking down one of the primary axes. But you can hold down Alt and middle mouse drag to pan, and right mouse drag to zoom in and out. So those are your navigation buttons for an orthographic view. Now someone says, is orthographic 2D or is it 3D with no depth? That's really more of a philosophical question. It's technically a 3D scene and you are looking at it through an orthographic view. So I mean, I would go with 3D with no depth. But still, that sounds more like a philosophical question than anything else. It's still going to behave as if it was a 2D picture. Okay, so there's the difference between an orthographic and a perspective view. Again, orthographics are going to be extremely useful when you're working with schematics or anything involving precision. Now there are other panels that you can add here as well. So notice when I split this into the 4 view, which I did just by tapping the space bar. And if you tap the space bar and you get anything else, you can click on your little 4 view button down here inside the toolbox, and that'll bring that up nice and quickly. Notice that each one of these viewports has its own panels menu. Also notice that you have various panels that can be added here. Underneath the panel submenu, you can bring up an outliner, the dope sheet, all of these different things are various windows that can be brought up. So for instance, watch this. Let's go to File, New Scene. We don't want to save changes. And over here, I'm going to go to Panel and bring up the visor. Now what the visor is a list of various example files that you can bring into your scenes if you want to, just to play with or see how stuff works. So let's see, if we go under, I don't know, there's all kinds of stuff. We have fluid examples, liquids, I don't know, fluids take too long. Let's do something simpler. End particle examples, there we go. These are nice and simple. Paint collision. Ooh, that looks fun. Let's just middle mouse drag that into our view. And with problems, data loss, whatever. We'll see if that poses a problem. Maybe it won't. It looks like it seems to be working. So I just opened up an example scene that was inside the visor just by middle mouse dragging it into the view. And here's what it looks like. We can even rewind and hit play and watch paint collide with itself and do fun things. And some of you might have even seen that picture in our newsletter. So for those of you who are like, are we going to learn how to do that? Well, you've now learned how to do that. Just open up the visor, bring in the example file, and then hit render. And look at that. It's even all shiny and glitzy and glossy. So that's just a quick example, not necessarily just of the visor, but of the fact that these panels can be a variety of different things. We could make this, say, the graph editor. So now we're monitoring any sort of animation, or this could be something else entirely. It could be the UV texture editor. Maybe we're modeling and adjusting UVs at the same time. The important thing is to just be aware that you can switch out any one of these viewports for additional panels so that you can change the nature of your viewport. Now I'm going to go to File, New, don't save, and get rid of that. I'll go ahead and bring the grid back up. So there's the menu bar for each one of our viewports. Now there's a toolbar as well, and these are just shortcuts. These are stuff that you could dig out of those menus if you really wanted to. This is just a faster way to get to them. So we have the ability to select our camera, and currently we're looking through the persp or perspective camera, so we can select that with a single click. We have the ability to open up the camera attribute editor. We have any bookmarks we've created, which are kind of like preset locations for various views. We can look at image planes. Some of the more useful things, we can turn the grid on and off. We can show a variety of different gates. So for those of you who are familiar with the idea, we have our film gate. We have the resolution gate if we need it. If you don't know what these mean, that's perfectly fine. Don't really worry about it. Essentially, the purpose is to show you what part of your scene will actually be visible in a render and what won't be. Then we have our different types of shading, which we've already kind of explored. But let me go ahead real quick, and I'll create, let's say, a polycube. And we can sort through wire. We can go to shaded. We can go to wireframe on shaded, which is very nice. In fact, that looks cooler if you create a sphere. So let me go ahead and make a quick polysphere. So there's wireframe on top of shaded, which is nice if you want to keep an overall view of your topology while you work. We have textured. We have use all lights, turn on shadows. We have high quality render. We have isolate select, which I don't really want to get into right now, but I'll just mention what it does. With isolate select, you can select an object, and then that's all you're going to see until you turn isolate select back off. Just the whole idea. And then at the very end, we have X-ray, X-ray active components, and X-ray joints. And really, the crux of X-ray is just allowing you to see through your objects. And that's really the biggest reason why it's there. Okay, so there are your viewport menu and your viewport toolbar. There are a couple of other things as well that I want to mention, and these are actually associated more with the properties because I already turned one of them off. You guys will probably have this in the upper right corner of your view. This is the view cube. This is a manipulator to just kind of help you move your scenes around in case you don't like holding down the Alt key. I'm not a big fan of it, I'll be honest, but you can switch to a right-hand view. You can rotate around and switch to a top view. You can rotate that view around. You have all these little arrows you can click on to switch to a left view, a front view, a right view, a bottom view. You can click home and go all the way back to your default view. It's just a little manipulator to help you kind of rotate around your view. It's nice. I don't like it. I never use it. So what I do generally is I go under my preferences, under interface, underneath interface, you'll see view cube, and I generally turn that off. So if you don't see it on mine, but you see it on yours, it's only because I turned it off. You also have the view axes. I do like to point these out to folks who are just getting started. If you can't remember what axis is pointing in what direction, always look in the lower left-hand corner of your view, because that's going to tell you what direction everything is pointing in. And yeah, that's true in VA. It's pretty much the only way I can describe it. It's nice. I don't use it. It's just, I got way used to Maya long before that was out, and I decided I never really needed that feature. Okay, now, there's one more bit of the interface that I want to show you that you'll either love and use all the time, or hate and you'll wish it didn't exist, and that's the hotbox. The hotbox is found if you hold down the spacebar. And it looks kind of scary. It's not that bad if you know what it's here for. First off, it gives you access to all of the menus. Not just those that are associated with a particular menu set, because we have all of our basic menus. We have our viewport menus. There's view, shading, lighting, show, render, and panels. Then we have the menus associated with the animation menu set, the polygon menu set, the surfaces menu set, the dynamics menu set, the rendering menu set, and then the end particles menus. And end particles is a new thing. Now, why is this so cool? Well, here's one of the biggest reasons why I think it's so cool. If I go into my settings and preferences, which is this little tiny icon in the lower right-hand side, it looks like there's a little running man inside of a window or something. I don't know what that's supposed to be, but I think it's a running man. Anyway, we can go under the interface and watch this. Show main menu bar, or show menu bar. In the main window? No. In the panels? No. Show panel toolbar? No. I don't want to see that. Show the title bar? No. I don't want to see that either. In the script editor? No, don't show it there. Alright, cool. UI elements. I don't want to see the status line or the shelf or the time slider or the range slider or the command line or the help line or the toolbox. And I don't want to see the attribute editor or the channel box, or the attribute or channel box. I want to hide those both. And then, let's see, what else do I want to turn off? Is there anything else I want to kill? I mean, really, that's the bulk of it. Now Maya is just this one great big floating window. So that now, once you kind of know what you're doing, you have, well, let's see, if I want to create an object, well, I can just hold down the space bar. Under the Create menu, let's go down to Polygon Primitives and create a cone. We'll drag on the grid. There's a cone. Now I want to move that cone. Well, there's a couple of different ways I could do that. We remember that W is move, E is rotate, and R is scale, but if for some reason you've forgotten, you can go under Modify, and there's our transformation tools, move, rotate, and scale. It's all right there in the hotbox. Move that wherever I want it to be. So you can turn Maya into just one great big viewport if that's what you want to do. And once you get the hang of using Maya, this is not a bad way to work. Even if you don't ever see yourself ending up in a situation where you literally hide each and every part of Maya, it is nice knowing that you can hide the parts that you're not needing right now, so that if you know you're modeling, we'll look at it this way. Let me jump back. Let's go to Window. If you guys have followed along and you need to reset things, there's a couple of different ways to do it. We can turn stuff on right here in the hotbox. For instance, you'll notice there's these little X hash marks, and these show you different quadrants, meaning if I click the mouse up here in the upper quadrant, this does one thing. The right-hand side does something else. The bottom does something else too. And the left does something else. So all four of these different quadrants have different functionality. So on the right-hand side, I can say, well, let's go ahead and turn on the status line. And let's turn on the shelf. And then let's turn on the toolbox and the time slider and the range slider and the help line and the command line. And then I can go back into the preferences because I've already opened that up. And I can go ahead and turn on the menu bar and in the panels. And I can show the panel toolbar and I can show the title bar. And I can save that. And then I can just click over here on the right-hand side and bring up the channel box, and then everything's right back to where it was. So definitely it is nice to be able to turn all that kind of thing off. But I do want to just kind of make mention. Let's say you're just going to be modeling, right? Your job right now is just to build the best spaceship ever. Now, in those cases, if you're just building something, are you going to be animating? Yes or no? Somebody tell me over inside of BuzzNet. No, you're not animating. You're just building stuff. So what you can do is use these little dotted areas. It's like right here. You see this little dot pattern? I can right-click on that and say, you know what? I'm not animating. So I don't need the range slider, and I don't need the time slider. Am I going to be punching in any mel commands right now? Probably not. So let's just go ahead and say turn off the command line. Now I'll leave the help line up. I'm relatively new to Maya, so I want to have something up that I can still access. Now, do you ever find yourself using the shelf? If you don't, well, turn it off. That's just precious real estate space that you're eating up. And really, for the most part, this is how I often find myself using Maya when I'm not animating. And yeah, whoever said no first, you get a cookie. There you go, Risen Force, you get a cookie. One virtual cookie just for you. Okay, so there is your look at the viewports and panels in general. Are there any questions so far? Is there an option for the hotbox to always open in the center of the screen regardless of mouse position? Not that I'm aware. I will say this though, generally to me that won't matter. It's just right now, because I'm recording this video, I am at a very, very low resolution. I'm at 1280 by 800. I never use Maya at this low of a resolution. In fact, right now I feel like things are very, very crushed in. So if you, I feel like if you're using Maya at full resolution, that won't be that much of a problem. But there you have it anyway. Now you can, you do have the hotbox controls, and I don't think we have anything here that will help you with that. But you can do this. For instance, if you know that you don't need the like the animation controls, watch this very carefully. I can click on hotbox controls, go to show animation, and turn off show hide animation, and now the animation menu's disappeared. And then let's say all we're doing is polygon modeling, right? So that means we won't need the surface menus, so we can go ahead and hide those. We won't need the rendering stuff, so we can go ahead and hide that. We certainly won't need the dynamic stuff, so we'll go ahead and hide that. And it looks like we could just hide everything, because I didn't see anything to specifically show or hide the end particles. Not saying it wasn't there, I just didn't see it. So we could just say show polygons and turn those on, and now all the hotbox has is just that one menu. So even that is pretty customizable in terms of what you want. And yeah, sure, Flash, you can have a cookie too if you really want one. It's kind of an older cookie though. Kind of stale, just saying. All right. So, just one brief second. It's all right, a cough and drink. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is working with 3D objects inside of Maya. Because really, you guys have already seen how to navigate the views, but you need to understand the basics of moving stuff around and manipulating objects. So let's start with the really simple stuff. I'm going to go to File, New, and don't save. And let me go ahead and put Maya back to the way it probably should be. So we'll go ahead and come back over here. Let's just say we show all here in the hotbox. And then I'll come over here and we'll turn on the command line and the help line. I turned off the help line. That was delicious. And the range slider. And the time slider. All right, so, and then if I turn the shelf back on, I think I should be right back to... Okay, that should be pretty much how Maya generally looks when you're using it. So, with a brand new scene, let's all go to Create. Let's just stick with polygon primitives for now, and we're going to make, let's do a cube. I don't really care what you make, but I'm going to do a cube anyway. And we'll drag that out to create it, and I'll hit 5 on my keyboard to shade it up. Now, moving, rotating, and scaling is some pretty basic stuff, and we've already seen the hotkeys for that. W allows us to move, E allows us to rotate. R allows us to scale. But let's talk a little bit about actually performing these operations. Let's start with the move tool. When you hit W, you get the move tool. This gives you 3 arrows pointing out of a yellow box. Each one of those arrows corresponds with a primary axis, and when you drag on that arrow, you are moving along that axis. So right now, I'm moving along X. Notice when I click on it, it turns yellow. It's no longer red. Now there is a color coding to this. There's a method to the madness here. RGB equals XYZ. It's important to keep that in mind because it's pretty consistent, not just in Maya, but in just about every 3D package I'm aware of these days. So, red is always going to be X, green is always going to be Y, and blue is always going to be Z. So you can tell at a glance which axis you're looking at just by using that color coding. Definitely keep that in mind. Now, this little square in the middle of your manipulator allows you to move the object in screen space. Now what that means is, screen space is kind of like having a flat plane that is pointed back at the camera. So it's a plane that is perpendicular to the angle that the camera is looking. And somebody said, why is mine a circle? Probably because you have snapping enabled. That would be my guess. So if you come up here to the very top, I would be willing to wager that one of these little buttons that has a magnet on it has already been highlighted. So you'd want to turn those off. Make sure you have no snapping on. Now, something to be aware of is your middle mouse button. Your middle mouse button is kind of like a generic manipulator tool, and you can use it in a lot of various ways. For instance, if I click on this square in the middle of my move tool and I click and drag with the middle mouse button, you'll see that I'm moving in screen space. If I click on the x-axis and then drag with the middle mouse button, I'm sliding along the x-axis. If I click on Z, you see I'm doing the same, and so on and so forth. Definitely a neat tool. Now somebody just said, yes, middle mouse button is quite annoying. I don't think so. Okay, maybe having come from Macs, maybe. Once you get the hang of it, it's very, very useful, and I'll show you some tricks as to how it is useful here in just a moment. Now, something else you can do with the manipulator, for those of you who are coming to this from Macs, you might be wondering, how do I move along a plane? You can hold down Control, and you can click on any given axis, and that will nullify that axis from the center of the manipulator. So what I just did is I control-clicked on X. And now take a look at my square. It is no longer moving in screen space. It is now moving in the YZ plane. And so now as I move that square, or using that square, we're only moving along the YZ plane. If I control-click on the Z-axis, it nullifies that. If I control-click on Y, then we're only moving laterally. You can control-click on that square again to put it right back to screen space. Now, the middle mouse button also acts as a virtual slider when used in conjunction with the channel box, and this is very, very handy once you get the hang of it. Now, somebody said, I can't select the whole object anymore, just the surfaces. How do I fix this? You have probably entered component mode. Press F8 until your wireframe becomes green and not just cyan, and then you should be able to select the entire object once again. So F8. Or you can click on this button here, which is select by object type as opposed to select by component type, and you should be good to go. Okay, so you can use the channel box along with the middle mouse button to create a virtual slider effect. So if I click on Translate X and then drag with the middle mouse button, you see I'm moving along X, or I can move in Y, or I can move in Z. You can also use this for all of your various functions as well, such as rotate and scale. So middle mouse is cool, but only once you kind of get the hang of it. So there's a lot about just moving. Let's talk a little bit about rotation. Now, I'm going to keep things very simple when it comes to rotation, because rotation can actually become a pretty involved lecture in terms of rotating in 3D space. In short, rotating in 3D space is very complicated. For now, we're going to make it look pretty easy. Your manipulator is broken up into 3 connecting rings. We have a red ring, a blue ring, and a green ring. Remember, RGB equals XYZ. So the red ring allows you to rotate around the X-axis. The green ring allows you to rotate around Y. And the blue ring allows you to rotate around Z. Now, we'll just point this out. If you start rotating around more than one axis at a time, so if I rotate a little bit around X, and then watch, as soon as I try to rotate around Y, watch my numbers over here in the channel box. Watch what happens. They all start updating in some really weird and spooky and frightening ways. That's because of gimbal lock. And yes, you can run into gimbal lock in Maya. Any application that is using Euler rotation algorithms does experience gimbal lock by its very nature. If you don't know what gimbal lock is, do not worry about it. I'm not going to go into a big long lecture about it because it's just outside of our current scope. For now, we're only worried about this tool in general, which allows us to rotate along any of our given axes. And really, if all you're doing is just worrying about the actual positional rotation of something, like if you just want it rotated in a particular way to look good on screen, you don't really care what these numbers are doing. You only care about what these numbers are doing when you're animating. So if you're not animating, if you're just maybe rotating this so that it looks right when positioned against the edge of the spaceship that you're building or something, then don't worry about it. You can just use the tool how it was designed, where you have one axis for each one of your, one ring for each one of your axes. But I do want to point this out because it seems to give certain people, certain beginners, a real miss. It really confuses some people. Take a look at the direction the x-axis is running. Right now it's running from left to right across our view, like so. And take a look at the direction that our X ring is pointing. Keep in mind that the way this manipulator works is like you're rotating around that axis. So if that axis was a pin going straight through the pivot point of the object, the red ring allows us to rotate around that X-axis. And sometimes that messes with some people. Okay, so there's rotation, and you have this outermost ring that's pale blue. This allows you to rotate in screen space. So as if you were rotating around a plane whose normal was perpendicular, or whose normal was parallel to the angle the camera's looking. Basically a plane that was perpendicular to our view. We're just spinning around that. Okay, now, one quick thing I did fail to mention about the Move tool, but it's true about the Move tool, the Rotate tool, and the Scale tool. You can press the plus and the minus keys to make those bigger and smaller. Why is that important? I've had people tell me that they seem to have a Move tool and they have something like a Scale tool, but their Rotate tool is missing. And it actually took me a little bit of back and forth to discover what they had done is they had made their tool so big it wouldn't fit on the screen anymore. Because this tool gets bigger as you zoom in and out. So if you just make it huge, no matter what your zoom level, you won't be able to see it anyway. So definitely remember your plus and minus keys. It will save you some hassle. Alright, so let's take a look at scaling. Now scale gives you these 4 boxes. A color-coded one for each one of the axes, and then a blue one that allows for uniformly scaling with all 3 axes. That's really all there is to it. Now we've talked about a few things here. We've talked about the manipulators. We've talked about the virtual slider and the channel box. We haven't yet talked about the attribute editor. But I did mention earlier that the attribute editor is very much like the channel box. Did anybody remember what the primary difference was? Just quick pop quiz. Can everybody tell me what the primary difference between the attribute editor and the channel box is? Who wants the cookie? Who can remember? Animatable probs. Channel box is keyable. There you go. That was closer to what I was looking for. The channel box is all keyable attributes. Attributes that can have animation applied to them. The attribute editor, on the other hand, is all of the attributes. So Waz, you get a cookie. Good job. every attribute that can be applied to this object in some way is found within the attribute editor. All of the attributes that can be animated can be found inside the channel box. Now we're not going to do it right now, but there is a way where you can determine what is and is not animatable to either add or remove things from the channel box. But if you want to go into the attribute editor and affect things like motion or like position, rotation, and scale, you have to know a few things about how Maya works. Because take a look at this. This object is more than just the sum of some attributes. It's made up of multiple nodes, and this is where things really start to get deep in terms of Maya. To our far left, we have what is called the transform node. And I'll talk a little bit more about these nodes in a minute. But if you want to affect the translation or position, the rotation or the scale of an object in the attribute editor, you have to be looking at its transform node, which is generally going to be on the far left. And here you'll see translate, rotate, and scale. Translate is the same as move or position. So we could take this and set it to 5. And take Y and set it to 10. And take Z and set that to 5 as well. So you can punch in values directly into the attributes here within the attribute editor, just like you can inside the channel box. You just have to have the right node selected. There's another place you can do it as well. Remember up here at the status line, we had these entry fields? You can use these to punch in values as well, and it's important to kind of know the difference of how these can work. You have X, you have Y, and you have Z. These are going to pay attention to the tool you currently have selected. So, if I have the scale tool selected, and I set Y to 10, invalid argument, W. Oh, that's fantastic. Let me make sure let me set this over to the move tool first, and make sure, at least for now, we're set to absolute transform. We're going to set this to 10, and boom, you see how that works. Let me go ahead and try that again with the scale tool, see if it did anything stupid. There you go. So we set Y to 10 with the scale tool, and now we have 10 times the scale along Y. Set it back to 1, and there we go. Now, these entry fields have two different ways to work. And we're not going to worry about rename and select by name right now. They can work absolutely or they can work relatively. If you set them to absolute and we take our X value and set that to 5, so let's not do that, not for scale anyway. Let's set this back over to move. It'll be easier to visualize. We'll set our X translate over to 5. And now I can keep entering it to 5, and it's not going to change anything. We've set it to an absolute position of 5 along the x-axis. However, if I set this to relative and set it to 5, we just moved 5 units in the x-axis. We're now at translate x of 10, which you can see here in the channel box. If I say 5 again, we're now at 15. I can say 5 again, we're now at 20, and so on and so forth. So you can use these to nudge an object by a given number of units. It's just another way to manipulate your objects around. Okay, now, the next thing I want to talk about a little briefly is the concept of parenting. Parenting allows you to take one object and make it the slave of another object, if you want to look at it that way. Basically to make one object the center of another object's world. Pardon me just a moment. Thank you. Okay. Now, there are a lot of different ways that parenting can work. We're going to keep this very simple just to keep things nice and clean within scope. But, let me delete this out. We're going to create some new objects. Let's go to Create, Polygon Primitives, and let's make a sphere. And I'm going to move this sphere up into the air. Now, to keep things simple, let's do this. Let's hit Control D, and I'll duplicate this sphere, and I'll make, well, actually I don't want to do it that way. Let's do it another way. Let me go to Create, Polygon Primitives. I'm going to make a smaller sphere. So let's drag out a much smaller sphere, like so, and this guy I'll duplicate a few times. Now, here's how parenting works inside of Maya. You can select an object, a child, hold down Shift, and select what will be its parent, and press the P key. P for parent. Now watch this. If I move the object that I had selected as the parent, the child comes with. If I select the child, it can move all by itself. This is a hierarchical relationship, and you need to be aware of how these work. You need to know about hierarchies and what they are to you, and what they mean. So this is what we've got right now. We have a parent, and we have a child. And the relationship works like so. Whatever the parent does, the child will do too. But the child relationship does not necessarily go back up to the parent. This doesn't happen. It's a one-way relationship. So, if I come back over to Maya, and we take this guy and this guy, select them both. So I'm holding down Shift, by the way. We didn't really talk much about selection, but if you select a single object, you can hold down Shift and select another object. Incidentally, you can hold down Control and deselect objects. So we'll hold down Shift and select both those, and then keep holding Shift. We'll select this guy. The last object you select will be the parent. We'll hit P. Now watch this. If I select my big sphere, everybody looks like they're selected because they are all children. Whatever I do to the big sphere also happens to the three children, including moving, rotating, and scaling. But there's kind of a special thing happening with the relationship here. Take a look at this guy's channel box, okay? This tiny little sphere. His translate x is about -14, translate y is -13, and translate z is 1. If I move the parent around, what do you expect the child to now be? What do you expect his transforms to be? Anybody? It'll be offset by z. MMO Dust says they will be the same, and MMO Dust is right. The translations for the child do not change at all. Why is this? That's because a parenting relationship is not entirely unlike what you have here on the planet Earth. Okay, so here's the Earth, right? There's a really terrible rendition of the Earth. And let's say this is you standing on top of the Earth. You're really big. In fact, you're choking because you're taking up so much room. You're way out here in space. Now, the Earth is constantly revolving. It's spinning around and around and around over and over again. It's also revolving around the sun, so the sun would be way out here. And it's constantly spinning around in this 1-year cycle. It's moving very fast, too. It's like 2,000 miles an hour or something crazy. I don't remember what the numbers are. But the Earth is moving very, very quickly. Do you perceive any of this motion? No, of course you don't. And if you think you do, you've probably been drinking. The point is that parenting basically takes one object and makes it in another object's entire world. So in this case, if we take a look at our little relationship here, according to this child, the parent object is its entire world. Whatever happens to the parent will also happen to the child, but the child doesn't notice it. Nothing seems to change as far as the child is concerned, because it's just like the planet Earth is constantly moving and spinning, but we don't care. We're too busy doing our own thing. So you could say that we are children of the planet Earth. And no, not in some spiritual Gaia sense either. Just in terms of a hierarchical relationship. Now, on the other hand, the children can move around and do whatever they want, and those changes will not necessarily update to the parent. Does this make sense to everybody so far? And MVA said, so the translation is relative to the parent. It is indeed. As a matter of fact, watch this. I'm going to wireframe view. I'm going to take all 3 of the translations of this child and set them to 0, and look where it goes. It goes to the center of the Earth. Or it goes to the center of the parent, anyway. So yes, its translations become relative to its location from its parent. So let's do one more level in our little hierarchy here. Let's create... Well, let's do cubes now. And now we'll grab these two guys, and then this sphere and hit P, and these two guys and hit this sphere and hit P, and these two guys and hit this sphere and hit P. And now what we have, if we jump back over to Photoshop real quick, is that these guys are all children of this parent. And now each one of those children has two children of their very own. So now if I jump back over to Maya and I grab this sphere, he moves his two boxes, this guy moves his boxes, and this guy moves his boxes. But if we grab the main parent, he moves everybody. It's important to be aware of that. It's also important to be aware of certain other things as well when parenting, such as if we do this. I can start doing some really nasty things to shapes with parenting if I'm not really careful. For instance, if I rotate a parent, actually I'm sorry, if I non-uniform scale a parent, so if I take this guy and scale him like so, watch what happens when I rotate one of these boxes. They start to skew. Now somebody just asked, can you give an example of how parenting can help in 3D modeling? I most certainly can, but I can also give you an example of how it can help in all kinds of other things like animation as well. But let's say that let me just do it like this. Let me nuke all this stuff. Let's say that I'm building an object. Let's do this. Let me grab, well, I don't know. I'm making it all up as I go anyway, right? Let's say we have a sphere. And I'm gonna change this sphere shape a little bit by scaling its vertices. If you're trying to follow along and you feel like I'm leaving you behind, don't worry about it. I'm not intending you to follow along with this part. And here's the fuselage of the coolest spaceship I've ever modeled. And then here's one of the engines of that spaceship. And maybe this guy's got a lot of engines, you know. So maybe there's like a sub-engine. Not this guy. Maybe this guy. And maybe this guy. All of these are vital components of this great big lumbering behemoth spaceship. I don't know what this thing looks like, but you know, here it is anyway. I can just parent all of these guys to my initial spaceship, and I can move them all as if they were just one great big unit. But if at any time, like let's say that this guy needed a propeller spinning on the front of it, that propeller could be parented as well, and I'd still have the ability to spin that propeller as if he was his own object, even though he is moving along with his parent the entire time. How do you click, drag, and duplicate at the same time? Well, I don't know. I haven't been clicking and dragging and duplicating. I've been hitting Control-D to duplicate. And every so often, I've been hitting Shift-D. And what Shift-D does is it saves whatever transformation you make. So the next time you hit Shift-D, it does it again. Now why is that cool? Well, watch this. If I hit Shift-D, and then we move this guy out, and a little forward, and then, oh, didn't mean to do that. I must think I'm using UDK or something. And rotate this a little bit, and then maybe also move him up a little bit. And then keep hitting Shift-D. Whoa! We get a big rotating helix of them. So yeah, that was fun. So there's a really quick example of how parenting can help you out. If you need any one object to follow another but still have its own transform so it can move independently, here's a really good example. Let's say you have an aircraft carrier, and your aircraft carrier is moving through the water and it's pitching up and down and it's rocking left and right, but you still have objects that need to be moving across the surface of that aircraft carrier. If those objects were children of the aircraft carrier, then wherever the aircraft carrier goes, they're going to move too, but you can still move them around on the deck independently. What is the hotkey you are using that goes right to creating an object in the viewport? That's generally is just a shorter way to get to create polygons, and I'm just holding down the Shift key and right mouse. It's not something I was really planning on going into because we're not going to be using much of it, but I'm just so used to using it that it's, ingrained into my blood from all the polygon modeling that I've done. So yeah, just hold down Shift and right mouse, and if you have nothing selected, it'll allow you to create some primitives. If you actually have something selected, it'll give you some modeling tools, but we're not going to get into the modeling tools. If you want to play with them, though, there they are. Okay, so there's just a few more things that I want to talk about. We've already talked about construction history. I want to take just a moment and discuss nodes, because we haven't really had a good opportunity to talk about that. So what I want everybody to do is to clear out their scene, make a new scene if you need to, and I want you to make a polygon cube. I want everybody to actually have a cube. Don't make something different, just in this one case. Next, I want you to go under Window and look under you'll see two node options here, where we will talk about the node editor. We're just not going to do it tonight. So if anybody's curious about that, we'll get to it. It just won't be this evening. It's a new feature for Maya 2013, and it's badass, but we're not going to talk about it right now. What I want to talk about is kind of inherent to Maya's architecture. We have the hierarchy and we have connections. Both of these go to the same window, being the hypergraph. What I want you to do is to click on hypergraph hierarchy. What this does is this gives you access to the Maya scene hierarchy. This shows you any parenting relationships that may exist with your objects. For instance, if I hit Control D and I make another cube, you'll notice I now have pcube1 and pcube2. You see that I can click on their nodes here in the hypergraph, and that selects them there in the viewport. Now, remember how we were parenting objects? I'm going to select pcube2, hold down Shift, and select pcube1, and hit P. Notice you can see that relationship, where pcube1 is the parent of pcube2. Now that's only a part of the battle. These are nodes that you're looking at. Specifically speaking, these are transform nodes. So this is the scene hierarchy. What's the name of this window? This is the scene hierarchy. I'm going to go ahead and delete out pcube2. I just want pcube1 for a moment. Now right here about halfway down the window is this little Y-shaped looking icon that says Input and Output Connections. This opens up, this is the same as going under Window and going to Connections. This opens up Maya's Directed Acyclic Graph, or the DAG, D-A-G. Now that's really technical terminology. If you just want to call it the scene connections, that's fine. If you want to sound really cool, call this the DAG. Directed Acyclic graph. Directed means that it has a specific flow. Information flows from one node directly toward another. It's a one-way relationship. Acyclic means you don't have any of this. If one node affects one object, that same object does not in turn affect the other object. That ends up with a cycling relationship, and that's bad. Maya won't let you do that. So this is considered to be acyclic. And it is, of course, a graph because it's graphing out those nodes. Now, why am I pointing all this stuff out to you? I mean, doesn't this sound like it's like way outside the scope of what we should be talking about? Well, in a way, it kind of is. But I want you to be aware of this really early on when you use Maya. Everything in Maya is a node. Everything you do is based off of a node, or will be affecting a node, or will be controlled by a node. Even this object that we see here looks just like a cube, is really just a combination of nodes that is giving us an end result. For instance, we have an input node. This input node contains the default settings for a polygon cube, and we can augment those settings. It's kind of like a base blueprint. We can augment those settings. We can adjust the blueprints to change what our cube looks like. As a matter of fact, if we go underneath the channel box, while we're selecting this, you'll see Polycube 1, boom, you'll see things like width, height, depth, and then subdivisions along each one of those. So I can take my width and increase it, my height and increase it. I'm doing that with the middle mouse button, by the way. Depth, I can increase that. If we show wireframe on shaded, just to show off a little bit, I can take subdivisions width and increase those, subdivisions height and increase those, and subdivisions depth and increase those too. Because all of that information exists inside the input node. Now what I'm showing you are the default nodes that are created with any new object inside of Maya. So you start off with an input node. Think of this like blueprints. Next, you have a shape node. This is really kind of like the heart of the object itself. All information about this object, all of its vertex locations, everything that makes it what it is stored inside the shape node at all times. As a matter of fact, if we select this, you'll notice there's not much we can do with it inside the channel box. That's because much of what it contains is not keyable. It is not animatable. However, if we go into the attribute editor, notice its name is pcube shape 1. You'll notice it does have several attributes that can be controlled. The mesh component display, mesh controls, tangent space, smooth mesh, all kinds of internal stuff, very deep stuff. Tessellation attributes. Basically, the shape itself is defined inside this node. I'll give you a tip. Most of the time, you won't really have to muck about with this node very much. Sometimes when you do more advanced stuff with scripting, you may need some information from the shape node. But for the most part, he's just there. He kind of represents he represents the vertices, edges, and faces that are making up your object, as long as it's a polygon. Next, we have the initial shading group, or the shading group node. This may not be the initial shading group. If you put another shader on this will actually be another node, but there will be something here. So we'll just call this the shading group. And this is the paint job. It's the easiest way to think of it. And if you want to keep everything kind of in the construction analogy thing, so the shape node basically is all of your wood and nails and lumber and materials and sheetrock that actually forms whatever it is you're building. Your input node is your blueprints, and your shading group is your paint job, allowing you to actually see it when you're done. Now, those three nodes are connected like so. The input node feeds its information into the shape node. The shape node then feeds information into the shading group. And there you have it. But there's a fourth node. You might have seen it. It's not connected to anybody. This is the transform node. The transform node sits out by itself. And he controls the where. So you build this object, but it's kind of like a mobile home or a modular house. Once it's all built, you can determine where it is with the transform node. Now, I'm going to throw this at you. If you're just seeing this for the first time and it's a little daunting and you have no idea what I'm talking about or why it's important, do not be alarmed. The biggest reason I'm showing you this right now is just so that you will remember it later on at some point as you start to get into it. I want you to be at least passingly familiar with the concept. If animating, does it also control when? I'm not sure what you mean. Now, when you animate an object to move it around a scene, you are animating attributes within the transform node, if that's what you're asking. So, yeah, I'm planting the seed. That's the old phrase we used to use for that. I just want to make sure you guys are at least passingly familiar with the concept of nodes and some of the default nodes that are created when you work with an object. Now, I want to show you a couple of other quick things. We saw this after a fashion earlier on, but I'm going to remind you. If I, and let me go a little bit more slowly here. If I hold down the right mouse button, I get a marking menu here that allows me to choose various components very quickly. So I could say faces. So let me grab some faces. And then I could take the long way, and we could go to Edit Mesh and choose Extrude, and just pull this up. And then I can hit G to repeat last command. That's right, G repeats the last command. I'm going to say that one more time for those of you who are taking notes. The G key on your keyboard repeats the last command. Very good. We can pull that up again and grab these guys and hit G again. So cool, I'm doing some really, really basic modeling. Now, back over here, look at what's happened to our graph. It suddenly looks crazy. Now, why do you suppose that is? Why do you think everything looks this crazy? Well, that's because every single operation we have performed is reflected in this network of nodes. Here's our input node. This is where it all started. We have our first extrusion, our second extrusion, and our third extrusion. All of those are feeding into our shape node, which is in turn feeding into our initial shading group. Everything that we perform, all of these operations create another node. Here's the great thing. We can go back in time in a sense. So if I go all the way back out to here, and I need to make a little bit of room, we can go all the way back to our Polycube 1 node. Remember, that was our input node. I can select that and I can change the width of my entire object. What is this really doing? This is like going back in time and saying, if I had built this object to be this wide, here's what it would look like now. Or if I had built it to be this deep, here's what it would look like now. It's literally changing a value further back in time. Now there's a catch to this. If you make changes that affect the number of vertices that you have, then all hell can break loose. What do I mean when I say that? If I change the number of subdivisions width, watch this. Things start getting very, very weird. The reason for this is pretty basic. I don't want to get too far into it, but it's because each one of these vertices has an ID tag, an ID number. And all of these operations are based off of that ID number. As I change the number of vertices, those ID numbers also change, and that confuses Maya. So our modeling basically changes at that point. It's like we pulled out different faces. So generally, you won't want to do that, but you can do things like change the width, height, and depth. We can go back to one of our earlier extrusions, and look at this. If I hit the T key to use my Show Manipulator tool, I can change how that extrusion happened. I can say maybe we extruded further on. Maybe the extrusion went in this direction. Maybe that extrusion rotated. Now you don't necessarily need to follow along with all this. All of this is outlining a very, very simple series of concepts. One, all Maya operations form nodes. These nodes form what is called construction history. You're going to hear that term a lot as you use Maya. It's construction history. And if you go back to our earlier analogy where we had with the input node, which was like blueprints, and the shape node, which is kind of like the object itself. It's all the different bits and pieces that make it up. And the shading group is the paint job. Then you can think of all these other nodes, like our extrusion nodes and whatnot, are various remodeling that we've done. We've brought in this device, which changes the shape of our house, or this device, which pushes in a new room, and things like that. Now, and Stephen Curtis just asked, and deleting history will break those connections. Actually, it's going to do a little more than that, and that brings us to our next thing. See, there's a problem with construction history. It's not much of a problem, but it is something to be aware of. If we go all the way back to our initial object, you'll notice we're getting a stack of things here. And just, again, I wouldn't try to follow along if I was you right this minute, but I can do an extrusion here, and an extrusion here, and an extrusion here, and then I'm just doing these because they're fast, right? extrusion here, and then here. And you'll notice something. This list is getting very long. Eventually, this list can become so long that it can start to bog down your computer. And in those cases, you'll want to delete construction history. Now, deleting history is very easy. Please remember this. Please write it down. You'll select an object in object mode. Press F8 if you're not, so you want to see a green highlight around it. Go to Edit, Delete by Type, History. All of those nodes are gone. It did not just delete the connections. In fact, what it did was it took all of those nodes, it took the input node and all of those extrusion nodes, and it recorded their data permanently into the shape node. So everything basically gets collapsed down to the shape node, and I can prove it to you. If we go back over to the hypergraph and take a look at our connections, all we have now is a shape node, our initial shading group node, and our transform node. Everything else is gone. So that's what deleting history really does. It takes all of those operations you've performed and records them all into the shape node permanently. You no longer have access to them. You can no longer go back and make changes to them, but it does free up precious system resources. Now, you can't do that all the time. You're going to get into that the deeper you get into Maya. Say if you've got a character that's rigged up and ready to animate and you delete his history, he suddenly will stop animating because your skinning process is based on history. And there are a lot of different things like that. So you'll have to know when to delete it and when not to. But generally, when you're modeling, you'll be deleting history a whole lot. Now, folks, that really concludes everything that I really wanted to talk about in terms of Maya tonight. I gave you a quick rundown of what Maya is. We talked about 3D space, the fact that Maya is a Y-up world. We talked in depth about the user interface. There are several different parts of the interface we haven't even touched yet. I just went over the visible parts, the stuff that you really need to know right now. We talked about viewport navigation and the various viewport modes. And we talked about Maya's we talked about 3D objects, moving, rotating, and scaling. We talked about parenting, and then we talked about Maya's graphs and the various nodes that you will create while you're working with objects inside of Maya. Now, this leads us to the project that we will be creating. And we're going to talk more about this project in the next class. Right now, again, tonight's class is really all about getting you up to speed with Maya, and it's a lot to take in, so I don't want to bury anybody too quickly. But in short, this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to make a very simple scene based around a cake. So I'm going to teach you guys how to make a very simple cake, which you can decorate in any way that you like. If you want to write stuff on it, you can. If you want to get fancy and cut a wedge out of it, you can do that too. But we're just going to build a cake. And we'll probably end up building a plate for it to sit on. Then we're going to build the star of our show. It'd be a little cherry. And this cherry's job is to bounce across the table and land in the center of our cake. This cake is also going to have a little sparkler on it. That's the goal anyway. It'll have a little sparkly with all kinds of sparks shooting off of it. That will be our project. But tonight I didn't want to bog anybody down with that. I didn't want anybody to have to be worried about creating anything tonight. If you're totally new to Maya, this was a lot to take in. And what I want you guys to do from here for this week is to get used to using Maya. Just associate yourself with flipping between some of these different viewport types. If you want to create some simple scenes and play with some parenting, you can certainly do that. And if you want to blow up the cake when the cherry lands, you can certainly do that. That's fine. Or burst it into flames, because burning stuff in Maya is just a single click. All right, fine. Just in case you guys need something fun to do this week, here's this, okay? And don't say I wasn't a nice guy. You can go to create whatever you want. Let's make, I don't know, a polygon sphere. That's kind of cherry-like, isn't it? Press F5 to go under your dynamics menu set. That's F5. And if you look under effects, you have create fire. Congratulations. Your cherry or whatever, your sphere is now on fire. And if you render that, there's what it looks like. So if you just are dying to do something vaguely interesting in Maya, there's a really, really quick thing you can do just because it's fun. I'm trying to see who's going to be the first person to be like, hey, how'd you do that? Tell me one more time, because they missed it and they really, really want to do it. Yep, I figured there'd be at least one of you. All right. Watch carefully. Make an object. Don't care what the object is. Doesn't really matter. I'm going to make a polygon sphere. There it is. Pull it up into the air. Hit 5, so it's all nice and pretty. Make sure it's selected. Press the F5 key. That goes to your dynamics menu set, right? Go under Effects and choose Create Fire. That's it. You're done. Just press play. Now, that'll play back really fast on my machine, so what I did is I took my range slider and set it to go to 500 frames, so I had a whole lot more frames. And now if you click the render button, you have something burning. So, there you guys go. That is everything that I wanted to go over tonight. It's a lot to take in, so I'm not going to burden you too much with homework. From here on out, though, what we're going to be doing is just tackling individual aspects of our project. So it will become much more project-based at this point. I just wanted to get one class out of the way that served as a primer for Maya to kind of get you at least passingly familiar with the interface and get you up to the point where you should be ready to start using it. So that will wrap things up for this class. Thank you all for attending. A big thank you to NATO for sticking things out. Again, there will be no homework this week. However, I do want to throw this out. I highly recommend that you go into the Member Sponsor Lounge and open up the Member Live Classes Homework Submission Steps thread. If you want to see where that is, don't worry about that. It's in the stickies. It's very close to the top, so go ahead and open that up. It would be a good idea to at least get these first steps out of the way, so you can go ahead and get your Dropbox account set up. You will be mailing these to NATO, so you can just click on Chris Morris's name and send him your email account that you use with your Dropbox, and that'll get things all taken care of. But unless there are any other questions, and I'm not seeing any, that will wrap things up for tonight. So thank you all very much, and I will catch you all next week. Take it easy.